Thank you very much, and good morning. Let me first begin by acknowledging and thanking the organizers of this event. I think it's a very important event, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in it. Let me also congratulate the authors and the sponsors of the ISJ report, which has been released today. This is, in my view, the most comprehensive and the most systematic assessment of suspected military activities conducted by the Iranian regime as outlined in the IAEA report of November 2011. In that report, and based on what the agency described as generally credible evidence, the IAEA identified 12 potential military activities, some of which could only be related to a nuclear weapons program. Among other things, these included work on high-speed switches for firing detonators, indications of work on uranium metal, the design of warheads for ballistic missiles, and the oversight of the nuclear program by defense agencies and military officials. For the past 3 years, the IAEA has sought to investigate these activities that the agency called, and I'm quoting, relevant to the development of a nuclear explosive device. Not surprisingly, the IAEA has met determined resistance from Tehran, despite multiple broken promises of cooperation. Earlier this month, the IAEA again cited Iran's lack of cooperation in resolving these key issues. As today's ISJ report points out, none of the major topics have been resolved. And I think most important is the finding in the report that, and I quote again, no serious indications that Tehran has stopped or abandoned this project or intends to do so were observed. On the contrary, all the available information points to the conclusion that it has resorted to further secrecy and concealment to keep its program intact and unhindered. Further revelations and information all point to the fact that a military program and military-related activities are at the heart of the Iranian nuclear program. Drawing on the ISJ conclusions, I will make 3 points regarding the current status of the ongoing endgame negotiations in Vienna. First, Iran's denial, deception, and stonewalling of the IAEA appears to be working. While the U.S. and other P5+1 members have called the resolution of potential military activities a central issue, and while they have expressed disappointment with Iran's lack of cooperation and transparency, these issues are not expected to block an agreement if other issues, such as limits on uranium enrichment, can be agreed. In this way, military-related activities are, in my view, being relegated to the status of an implementation detail, left to the IAEA to resolve at a later date, a date which I'm convinced will never come about, particularly if there's an agreement signed before they are resolved. It's almost like the P5+1 have accepted the premise that there are two separate and distinct programs, a civilian one for peaceful purposes and perhaps a military one that, at least at one time, included the design of a nuclear warhead. This notion that there is a peaceful program divorced from the military pursuit of a nuclear weapon is exactly what Tehran has sought to promote. But as the ISJ report today makes clear, this is a false notion. This takes me to my second point. In the November 2013 Joint Plan of Action, the P5+1 made two fundamental errors. First was allowing enrichment, allowing it despite the fact that there are multiple UN Security Council resolutions calling for its complete suspension. And second, despite Iran stonewalling on the critical issue of military activities. The second error was relieving sanctions that were having a very negative effect on Iran's economy. Both of these steps undercut the prospect for a negotiated outcome that would achieve the goal of preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. As long as suspected military activities remain unresolved, permitting any enrichment is tantamount to accepting Iran as a nuclear weapons threshold state. As for sanctions relief, the result was to relieve pressure on the Iranian regime to end its quest for nuclear weapons and actually to harden the Supreme Leader's position on enrichment. Letters to the Supreme Leader suggesting a commonality of interest in fighting ISIS likely have the same effect. Again, in my view, this is fantasy. As important as it is to defeat ISIS, the most important strategic interest of the West is to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapons capability. From a non-proliferation perspective, accepting Iran as a nuclear threshold state will only lead to further proliferation in the region and will undermine the NPT treaty regime. As a nuclear threshold state, Iran will be more, not less aggressive in its ambitious anti-US and anti-Western agenda across the region, in supporting Assad in Syria, in undermining US allies, in supporting terrorism, and of course in increasing the already brutal repression of its own people in Iran. This leads to my final point, my prognosis for the negotiations. We could, in my view, very well have a bad agreement as soon as next week. I know I've seen all of the press reports about the lack of progress and the wide gap in positions. The fallback, of course, which is already being set up by the press as the best case outcome, is to extend the deadline. Doing so would likely further undermine sanctions and permit Iran to continue to expand its nuclear program, including, we have to assume, its weapons program. Remember, it was Rouhani who bragged that when he was the nuclear negotiator, he fooled the West, and he bought more time through negotiations for the nuclear program to grow. A better approach, better than a bad agreement now or continuing negotiations for a bad agreement later, is not to extend the negotiations, but to return to full, in fact, additional sanctions on the regime, to pressure the regime to give up its quest for a nuclear weapon, and to stop both its enrichment and its weaponization activities. Now, many will say that this is an unachievable goal. I would simply say that this is for the whole ballgame. We have succeeded in the past in stopping nuclear programs in Libya, for example, in moving forward through pressure, not through concessions. And I think we have to assume that for our objective to be achieved in Iran, we must do the same thing. Thank you very much.